Morning, government class. It is Wednesday, April 15th, which is normally tax day, the day your federal and state income taxes are due. That's changed this year, which is unusual, but it's because of the economic downturn, the coronavirus, quarantine, and everything. So the due date for federal and state taxes for those of us who have jobs is pushed back to July 15th this year. So your parents are probably not running around like chickens with their heads cut off if they normally do that this time of year, trying to get their taxes completed. And that's what I'm normally doing, so I don't have to do that today either. Continuing our discussion today of the creation of domestic public policy and the role of interest groups. Today's section in the book talks about whether or not interest groups are good or bad. You may have noticed that we live in a time in America where we are very commonly said to be divided. We're very polarized is the term you see a lot. No one agrees on anything. We're very polarized. We should get back to unity in this country. The problem with looking at it that way is that there are a lot of issues in American public life right now that people do have disagreements about, and that those disagreements don't need to be papered over in the name of some kind of mythical American unity. We need to hash them out, and as is the idea behind the Constitution, be able to compromise in ways that no one gets everything that they want, but everyone gets some of what they want. That's the idea behind constitutional compromise, where that's possible. Some issues have come up that people have taken pretty hard and fast positions on, and whether those positions are good or bad kind of depends on the person. Your own point of view. I know myself, you guys know I'm a partisan political animal, and the way I view a given interest group generally tends to depend on whether or not I agree with them. But when you think about interest groups, just think about groups of American people getting together to organize to push or present a particular point of view about a topic. Interest groups can range from the National Rifle Association, if the Second Amendment or guns are your thing, to if you are in favor of women's reproductive freedom, National Abortion Rights Action League, or NARAL, might be your thing. These are just examples of interest groups. So interest groups, good or bad, is the heading for today's section in the book. Many have long viewed interest groups with suspicion and foreboding. They have feared that some would become so powerful that they would be able to shape public policies to their own narrow and selfish ends. That is kind of the goal, right? Okay. James Madison gave voice to that view in 1787. In the Federalist number 10, he argued that inevitably people join together to pursue common interests. Yeah, that's kind of what we do. That's kind of why we have governments, right? They form factions, Madison's term for what we now call interest groups. He warned that those factions, left unchecked, could dominate public decision-making because of size, resources, and or leadership. This leaves me wondering a little bit what James Madison thought the role of the individual citizen was supposed to be in government. If the idea for Madison was to just elect people to go represent us and then not have any more to do with them, just send them to Washington or send them to the state capitol and let them do whatever they want, I'm not sure exactly what the alternative would be otherwise to organizing in groups and working to affect public policy change towards your own ends. That's kind of what citizenship really is. Madison believed that a society could eliminate factions only by eliminating the people's fundamental freedoms. He argued that the mischiefs of factions could best be controlled by a political system in which the powers of government or the ability to make public policies are fragmented. That is a major reason why, he said, the Constitution provides for a separation of powers and checks and balances, and for a federal system of government, to make it unlikely that one group can override the interests of other competing groups. Nearly 50 years later, Alexis de Tocqueville was deeply impressed by the vast number of organizations he found in this country. Tocqueville, a Frenchman, toured much of what was the United States in the 1830s. In his work, Democracy in America, by the way, very important reading, ought to read that sometime, but it's a lot. In his work, Democracy in America, he wrote that, and I quote, "In no country in the world has the principle of association been more successfully used or more unsparingly applied to a multitude of different objects than in America." And in a similar vein, he also observed that, again quoting, "Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations, not only commercial and manufacturing, but of 1,000 other kinds, religious, moral, serious, futile, extensive or restricted, enormous or diminutive." And if you look around you, you can find all manner of organizations. This is what de Tocqueville was talking about. Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, the Rotary Club, all sorts of organizations to promote different ideas, different actions. Even your fantasy football group would fall under this category as kind of a social organization. So Americans, Tocqueville is saying, more than really any other nationality in the world, have tended really from our founding to do this, to organize and to push for things that we want. Are those associations or interest groups good or bad? To answer that question, you must weigh, on the one hand, the function those groups perform in American politics, and on the other hand, the various criticisms often leveled at them. Okay, so the valuable functions. First, among their several commendable functions, organized interests help to stimulate awareness of and interest in public affairs. This is, again, Citizenship 101. Public affairs are those issues and events that concern the people at large. Interest groups raise awareness of public affairs mostly by developing and publicizing those policy positions they favor, and by opposing those they see as threats to the interests of those members. So if you were to take the NRA, National Rifle Association, as an example, okay, if I were a member of the NRA, then I would be a member of the NRA if I identified as one of my most important freedoms the ability to own and carry whatever firearm at whatever time, in basically whatever setting. So if I'm a member of the NRA, then I'm going to expect that organization to fight against any law or any litigation that would restrict those freedoms for me and for other members of the NRA, and to promote laws that would increase those freedoms or maintain those freedoms. And that's going to be the same for any interest group, no matter what the issue. Second, interest groups represent their members on the basis of shared attitudes rather than on the basis of geography, by what their members think as opposed to where they happen to live. Public officials are elected from districts drawn on maps, but many of the issues that concern and unite people today have less to do with where they live than with, say, how they make a living. A labor union member who lives in Chicago may have much more in common with someone who does the same kind of work in Seattle than he or she does with someone who owns a business in Chicago or runs a farm in another part of Illinois. So interest groups are going to kind of transcend geography. It's not going to have to do with joining a group, say with me. My family and I live here in Claremore. A geographically representative group would be, me joining, I don't know, Teachers of Claremore or something like that, some association for Teachers of Claremore. But I might not have as much in common with them as I would a nationwide organization of teachers in their 50s who wear reading glasses or something like that. So these interest groups are going to be a lot more organized along the lines of issues rather than where people live, rather than geography. Third, organized interests often provide useful, specialized, and detailed information to governments. For example, unemployment, price levels, or the sales of new and existing homes. These data are important to the making of public policy, and government officials often cannot obtain them from any other source. This flow of information works both ways. Interest groups frequently get useful information from public agencies and pass it along to their members. Fourth, interest groups are vehicles for political participation. This is kind of my big thing about them, why I think interest groups are in general a good deal, because they provide a way for people to engage with their government. Most people are not inclined to run for and hold public office or even to volunteer for a campaign. For many Americans, then, interest groups are a convenient and less time-consuming way to help shape public policy. They are a means through which like-minded citizens can pool their resources and channel their energies into collective political action. One mother concerned about drunk driving could not, accomplish very much acting alone. Thousands of people united in an organization like MAD, which stands for Mothers Against Drunk Driving, certainly can and do. Fifth, interest groups add another element to the checks and balances feature of the political process. Many of them keep close tabs on the work of various public agencies and officials, and thus help to make sure that they perform their tasks in responsible and effective ways. So these are what are called non-governmental watchdogs. Basically, a lot of times you'll have these groups formed around a particular interest or a particular issue, and they're going to keep close tabs on whatever government official or group is over that issue or has to do with that issue. And if that government group is not responding to the will of the people or becomes corrupt in some way, these non-governmental groups can sound the alarm, can whistle blow, if you will, and bring attention to that and hopefully get any problems that are arising changed and dealt with. Finally, interest groups regularly compete with one another in the public arena. That competition places a very real limit on the lengths to which some groups might otherwise go as they seek to advance their own interests. For example, the automotive industry may work to weaken or postpone auto emission standards imposed under the Clean Air Act. Their efforts may be opposed and to some extent counterbalanced by environmental and health-related organizations. Okay. To go back to our NRA example, following the shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary in, 2012, there have been a couple of parent groups that have arisen promoting the idea of responsible gun control, gun ownership, and those groups stand in opposition to and kind of serve as a counterbalance for the NRA as well. So criticisms of public interest groups. All of what has just been said is not meant to suggest that interest groups are above reproach. On the contrary, they can be and often are criticized on several accounts. The potentially negative side of interest groups is sometimes all too apparent. Many groups push their own special interests, which, despite their claims to the contrary, are not always in the best interests of other Americans. Their critics often make several more specific charges. First, some interest groups have an influence far out of proportion to their size, or for that matter, to their importance or contribution to the public good. Thus, the contest over who gets what, when, and how is not always a fair fight. The more highly organized and better financed groups often have a decided advantage in that struggle. This issue can kind of come down to the idea that gets talked about these days, which is privilege. If you have more money, if you have more business contacts or social contacts, if you are privileged in that way, you are more likely to be able to create an effective lobbying organization or interest group than someone who might have been born into poverty or just doesn't have the same access to a political or social network that you do. And so one of the problems with interest groups is that it can tend, they can tend at times to reinforce ways of being that aren't very democratic, aren't very fair. Okay. Second, it is sometimes hard to tell just who or how many people a group really represents. Bella would like a word with the class. Hello, Bella. I think she wants to go for a WALK. I'm going to have to do that as soon as I get off here, guys. Second, it is sometimes hard to tell just who or how many people a group really represents. Some groups have titles that suggest that they have thousands, even millions of dedicated members. Some organizations that call themselves such things as the American Citizens Committee for or People United Against are in fact only fronts for a very few people with very narrow interests. Third, many groups do not in fact represent the views of all the people for whom they claim to speak. Very often, both in and out of politics, an organization is dominated by an active minority who conduct the group's affairs and make its policy decisions. Finally, some groups use tactics that, if they were to become widespread, would undermine the whole political system. These practices include bribery and other heavy-handed uses of money, overt threats of revenge, and so on. Instances of that sort of behavior are not at all common. They are not altogether unknown, however. Okay, so you have a good side of interest groups, a bad side of interest groups, and you got to kind of weigh all these things in the balance. But generally, for me, as someone who wants to see more participation in the political process from all Americans, I'm generally myself going to come down more on the side of interest groups being a positive influence on American public life. All right, guys, more tomorrow. Hope you're having a good day, and we'll see you then. Bye.